I've gotten to know Deborah Ross in recent years in various ways. First, through her historic photo contributions in the Olympian. You might have seen her contribute that. Next, I met her through her history online of the Olympia Historical Society called Where Are We, I think it's called. And then through her YouTube history video series called Now Where Were We? And so she's got all kinds of questions about where we are. Anyway, she came here from the East Coast over 25 years ago and has a long list of involvements in the community, including the one for which we now have her here today, and that is the history of what I still tend to call Panorama City, but it's now just Panorama. And Deborah's become a Panorama's resident archivist, researching over 50 years of scrapbooks and blueprints and photo albums and videos and a lot of historical treasures that we call ephemera. That's a word that I've adopted, ephemera now. It's pretty nice. Anyway, I've come to appreciate her work very much, and I'm honored to welcome her here for our History Talk series at the Schmidt House. Let's give a big historic welcome to Deborah Ross.
Thank you very much, Don, and thanks to the Foundation for inviting me here today. It's great to see some familiar faces, and including some faces of people who were involved in some of the events that I'm going to be talking about today. So I hope I don't do too many bloopers, and if I do, that you'll correct me in private afterwards. But there will be an opportunity for about 5 or 10 minutes of questions and answers after my talk, and I look forward to meeting with all of you for a few minutes afterwards as well. So with that, let's just go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to say is that I want to preface my remarks by saying that from time to time I may be offering some opinions, and these are entirely my own. They're not Panorama's, Panorama Management's, or the resident council's. And I also want to acknowledge my reliance and gratitude for the work done by past Panorama residents, including Berta Kazmar. Her compilation here, Panorama History, the First 50 Years, is an amazing resource. It is available in our local libraries if you want to check it out. And also, I believe there's a few copies at the Panorama gift store if you wanted to take a look. It's a wonderful resource. And I also wanted to thank previous archivists and historians at Panorama who have collected all of these materials over 50 years, and particularly my recent past historian, Sandy Brownstein, who managed to digitize all of the collections so that anybody can take a look online and and in our computer resource room for anything you want to know about Panorama history. All of the images that I'm going to be showing to you today are from the Panorama archives, except as you'll see on the screens as we go along. So this talk is not going to be a detailed blow-by-blow history of Panorama. You're probably grateful for that. But it does represent some aspects that I find interesting and informative. And I do encourage you to read Berta's compilation, and happy to answer any questions you might have either today, or if you want to just send me an email, I'll do my best to answer them. So let me launch right in. For thousands of years before Americans arrived in Puget Sound region, the land now occupied by Panorama was a rich source of sustenance, such as camas bulb. Sorry, we're going back and forth here. Such as camas bulbs and berries, as tribal members foraged from their winter and spring dwellings near the lowland rivers. And today there's only a few small remnants of these prairies, like this area shown here, which is the Scatter Creek Prairie in South Thurston County. Europeans began arriving in this area in the early 19th century, but for the most part did not interfere with or affect the lifestyle of local tribes. But in the late 1840s, the first American settlers crossed the Columbia River and started establishing homesteads here with the tacit approval of the United States government. The extended Chambers family was among the first to arrive in the Puget Sound area, consisting of Thomas and Latita Chambers and 7 children, including David Chambers. David and Elizabeth Chambers arrived here in 1848 after spending a short time in the Willamette Valley and filed a claim for 640 acres under the Donation Claim Act. They began clearing the land and establishing a homestead and farm on the prairie adjacent to what's now called Chambers Lake. In 1851, David Chambers returned to the Willamette Valley and bought some fruit trees from orchardist Henderson Llewellyn, who had brought 800 fruit saplings to Oregon in 1847 from Iowa. One of these, a black heart cherry tree, was planted near the homestead, and by 1853, Elizabeth Chambers was serving cherry preserves to fellow pioneer George Himes. The tree continued to bear fruit until well into the 1920s. And in this photograph, we see members of the Chambers family posing under and in among the limbs of the huge expanse of what was then a famous and venerable specimen. If you look closely, and those of you in the back are never going to see this, I encourage you to go online and take a look. You'll see at least 4 members of the Chambers family in and among the limbs. And when I posted this as 4 members, somebody commented that, no, I can see 6 there. So you have to look closely to see them all. And in the 1920s, the tree had to undergo major surgery, and pieces of the tree were used to create 25 gavels that were sent to regional historical societies, as well as the Historical, Memorial, and Art Department of Iowa as mementos. And I've recently discovered that the gavel that was sent to Iowa is still in the collection of the Iowa Historical Society. I'm hoping someday to get a picture of that. The original Chambers cherry tree no longer exists, but a huge fruit-bearing cherry tree located just a few feet west of the original Chambers Blackheart cherry has also far outlived the normal lifespan of a cherry tree and still bears fruit. I like to think that this tree is one of the offspring of the famous Chambers cherry, and I also hope someday to be able to confirm this. This painting by Edward Lang was made about 1890 and shows that the homestead was well established by that time, with a windmill pumping water, several outbuildings, and a wide drive. And for orientation, the drive is now what is approximately where Willow Street is coming in from the north. And you can see the southern lobe of Chambers Lake peeking in the distance, a little strip of blue in the far distance of this painting. In 1917, Walter Chambers sold some of the original acreage to the Olympia Country and Golf Club, which later sold it to the Mountain View Golf Club. The Chambers home was expanded and became the clubhouse, and golfers teed off near the home. The golf club thrived for a number of years, but went into decline around the time of World War II. And then an ambitious young developer came along in the 1950s. Morris Loveless, known as Mo, had been buying up property all over the Lacey area for a few years before he set his sights on the property on and around the golf club. He had developed shopping centers as well as building and selling homes in the area. He entered into discussions with the owners of Mountain View in the late 1950s. At that point, a woman called Hazel Post contacted Mo and suggested that she might be interested in building a nursing home in the area. I've not been able to find out anything about Miss Post other than the fact that she was building nursing homes in Oregon. But in any case, she came to visit Mo. And her suggestion did not meet with a lot of enthusiasm because he viewed nursing homes as dreary, unattractive places. But about that time, he met another woman named Margaret Whyte, the director of the Washington State Council on Aging, who had a revolutionary idea. While there are different stories about who came up with the idea of a continuing care retirement community, it's clear that it was a collaboration between Panorama's organizer Mo Loveless and Margaret Whyte. And let's hear their stories.
And you know, a little story about 3 stages of life, you know, and it's childhood. Well, that's a little too early for me to deal with, you know, so, and then there was adulthood, and that's the people I'd been working with, building houses for. And then there were these people that they said, "Hi there, Joe, gee, you're looking good." So they're the looking good people, and that's what all of us in this room, now we're looking good. Well, what are you going to do with looking good people?
We were having, at that time, I was executive secretary of the State Council on Aging and directing the statewide program on aging. And we were preparing for the White House Conference on Aging, which was to be in 1961. So in the fall of 60, we were having conferences all over the state to determine what people felt were the needs, the major needs of our aging population. We, at this conference in Seattle, one of the main emphasis was on housing. This kept coming out. And people from Thurston County particularly mentioned how much we needed housing for older people in Thurston County. The following one of the sessions, Mo Loveless came to me and introduced himself, and he said, a group of us in Olympia are planning to develop a retirement community. And we've been doing a lot of studying. We've been visiting in other retirement communities throughout the country, and we want to get into this and would like any help you can give us on this. So following this, I did offer any help I could give and met with the developers on several occasions. This was not going to be the type of retirement home that was being built in other parts of the state, high-rise, one building type of homes. But it was going to be a small community in which there would be many types of houses and of living quarters and many types of services. And this was the emphasis throughout, which we certainly agreed with and wanted to encourage as much as possible.
Panorama City was a unique contribution to retirement living in the Pacific Northwest. It was the first continuing care retirement community, or CCRC, in the area, and one of the first in the nation. Active residents could move in and take advantage of independent living and a multitude of activities, but then wouldn't have to move into a distant nursing home or other facility when they could no longer live independently. Second, and this was unique as far as I know, Panorama City was intended as a for-profit CCRC. Indeed, Mo told investors that they stood to make millions from their investments. I can hear from some of your laughter that, as we will see below, this corporate model was to present significant challenges. While there's some difference of opinion about the first resident to move into Panorama, this newsletter identifies her as Mrs. Emma Maxwell. The McGandys moved in the same week in the fall of 1963, and at that time, only a few units had been built, with many more to come soon. From the first, Panorama was an architectural innovator, hiring some of the area's most prominent architects and experimenting with different living concepts. As someone who's just learning about mid-century modern architecture, I feel that Panorama's campus is in some ways a showcase for the huge variety of architectural innovations from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and in a smaller way through the present time. Margaret Whyte certainly deserves the credit for bringing the idea of the House of Freedom to Mo Loveless, and here's how she describes the concept.
At the White House conference, we had a model home which had been developed by the Douglas Fir Plywood Association and the National Council on Aging. They had been working on this model home for about 2 years, and Douglas Fir Plywood built the home in Washington, D.C., just about 2 blocks from our conference headquarters. And everyone at the conference, which was around 1,000 people, went through this house and made suggestions or criticized the home so that it could be developed into a final design. And that design was called the House of Freedom. After we got back from the conference and brought this idea back about this model home, the group here decided that they would use that as their basic home, so that the houses themselves and the fourplex garden courts would be designed after the model House of Freedom. Grab bars in the bathroom, lower light switches so that people in wheelchairs could reach them easily. Higher wall plugs so that if in a wheelchair you did not have to get down too far to get to the wall plugs. Level floors, no steps of any kinds.
And wider doorways.
And wider doorways, definitely wider doorways, at least 3-foot doorways, everything throughout the house. And lower windows so that people could have good view
Visibility.
from the yards and so forth.
Panorama Hall began construction soon after the first homes were built. Its circular shape was reminiscent of the Seattle World's Fair, as well as the Jetsons cartoon show. In fact, one early drawing, which I've seen, even included a rooftop tower, apparently intended for tethering personal flying machines. Recent renovations have obliterated much of the circular exterior, but if you do visit Panorama Hall, you can see vestiges of that circular design. As we'll note further below, Panorama City was just one of several companies or enterprises owned by the blanket company, Panorama Corporation. One of Panorama City's sister companies in early years was Modern Modules, located east of the Panorama City campus. The company collaborated with noted architectural firm Bennett & Johnson to design and fabricate modular homes and marketed them throughout the area. Modern module homes were used to create the Boulevard area of Panorama campus, just to the north of the Slater-Kinney entrance. And incidentally, as a marketing gimmick, Panorama donated a modular home to be auctioned off at the annual auction of Patrons of South Sound Cultural Activities, or POSCA. This building still exists on Carlyon Avenue in Olympia, and I'm guessing the residents are not aware that they are living in a Bennett & Johnson home. On a rainy day in July of 1968, Warren Magnuson and Governor Dan Evans spoke to a group of residents and dignitaries for the dedication of the new Chalet building. The mid-century design by Seattle architect George Bolliton was meant to mimic the swept wings of a jetliner. And this concept is most visible from the air as shown in this Google Maps image. The 5-story Quinault building was the second apartment building to be completed on the Panorama City campus. It's designed by Bennett & Johnson. Was rather pedestrian, that's my opinion. However, the team also designed a 4-story tower adjacent to the Quinault with the idea that each floor would be devoted to various campus activities. A Seattle stained glass artist, Marion Caesar, was commissioned to create a 4-story stained glass curtain wall, with the top 2 stories having religious symbolism as they were to be the windows of the chapel. So those of you who are familiar with the Capitol Center building, also by Bennett & Johnson, down by the lake in Olympia, will recognize the curtain wall design as characteristic of the times and this architectural firm. And this building, soon to be called Views on Fifth, will, unfortunately in my opinion, retain only vestiges of the original curtain wall design. So mid-century modern lovers may have to content themselves with enjoying our own version of that concept. And incidentally, as we've also noted, Bennett and Johnson designed many of the residences on the Panorama campus. One element that required a gentle nudge from residents was in the area of sustainability. When funds were being raised for the Panorama Auditorium, residents Artie and Ara Browning were particularly vocal in urging sustainable living techniques and features. Putting their money where their mouths were, they issued a $50,000 matching challenge to set aside funds to upgrade to sustainable design. Ultimately, $160,000 of so-called green dollars were designated to upgrade the building's design to incorporate green features, a record that both Panorama and its residents can be proud of. And since then, the corporation and residents have worked hard to incorporate sustainability in many of their operations, though, in my opinion, they still have a little ways to go in that respect. So I've been asked by Don to spend some time on the seamy underbelly of Panorama's history. Probably what you all have been waiting for. So I scoured the archives and finally came up with a couple of items that might fit the bill. One early controversy involved the serving of alcohol. A resolution of the resident council conveyed the desire that no alcohol be served on the grounds of Panorama. Well, it's not clear how long this policy was in effect, but if any of you have visited the bistro on our campus, you know how it ultimately turned out. So, Don, is that going to do it? No? Oh, okay. All right. So this is the Great Goose Battle of 1975, which may have led to the current contract requirements that residents live harmoniously with each other. An 80-year-old Panorama City resident, upset with the mess left in his yard by visiting geese, yesterday charged after the fowl with a 6-foot club. Another resident, 90 years of age, witnessed the younger fellow's attack on the birds and asked him why he wanted to hit the geese. At this point, the angry club-carrying octogenarian turned on his fellow resident and charged toward him, yelling an obscene threat. The threat was punctuated with the 80-year-old hitting the 90-year-old on the arm with the 6-foot club. The 90-year-old man's wife ran out and escorted her bruised husband home. And the geese were last seen flying south. So, Don, is that good enough for you?
I'll give you one more no.
All right. Okay, here we go. From the first, Panorama City faced financial challenges. A large part of this was that in order to entice residents to move in, Mo Loveless felt he had to do everything at once: build residences, build a nursing home, and create a space for recreational activities. And he had to do this and keep fees affordable at the same time. Basically, he was trying to eat his cake and have it too. From the beginning, the fee structure included a one-time buy-in fee and a monthly fee. The plan was that the fee would be enough to cover not only costs of building the residences, but enough to capitalize the nursing home and Panorama Hall recreational facility. In addition, Mo developed a fairly complex institutional structure designed in part to reduce tax obligations. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. But in any case, the fees set were not nearly enough to do what needed to be done. And this chart of prices shows that a 2-bedroom apartment, a resident would deposit as little as $7,000, which was fully refundable, and then pay only $138 per month, which would include all utilities and amenities. The price was extremely reasonable even for that time, and not nearly enough to finance the construction of Panorama Hall and the C&R buildings. So Mo started borrowing money, and within a short time, he had borrowed from as many as 11 financial institutions, as well as stockholders who'd provided the initial funding. In addition, there may have been what early Panorama investor Dana Kintner called
business shenanigans.
Panorama City was part of an empire of shopping centers, residential developments, manufactured home park on Long Lake, the modern modules that was discussed earlier, and even a panorama yacht, which appeared and disappeared from asset records in a somewhat mysterious fashion. There's some suggestion in Mr. Kintner's remark that Mo may have been a bit careless in how he moved money around among his various investments. And the banks financing the construction of the Quinault apartment complex, for example, wondered how the never-ending demand of funds towards its construction never seemed to produce any progress toward completing the structure. With all this, Panorama was operating on a shoestring in its early years. Doris Stussy, who was hired as a sort of all-in-one manager of resident life, describes the environment in the 1960s.
And I came here, and Mo said to me, now, you've got to come and help us. And I said, what do you want me to do? He said, I just want you to be around so that I can say to you, take care of this, take care of that. So I wound up, every time he had a problem, he'd say, take care of it. And that's how I got the job.
You must be a very resourceful lady.
Honey, I didn't have any money. I had to do, you know, we didn't have money. I don't know how many people remember Earl Joy. Yeah, and Earl and I wouldn't cash our checks when we got them, because we were trying to have enough money to pay the grocers so that we keep food in the convalescent center.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And many a time we didn't cash our checks.
By the fall of 1972, the banks and investors had had enough. They ousted Mo Loveless as chair and appointed a new president, Gerald Youngblood. He carried on valiantly for some time, but the company continued to experience significant financial struggles. Youngblood left Panorama in 1976. In a bitter stockholders meeting that lasted 12 hours and was later called the Long Meeting, two brothers, Jack and Charles Lewis, took over the corporation, pledging their personal assets to keep it alive. Charles was soon killed in a plane crash, and Jack was solely at the helm. Although his manner was sometimes abrasive and, as we'll see below, led to further controversies, both inside and outside of Panorama, he did finally manage to move Panorama City towards a somewhat stable financial situation. In its early years, Panorama City had a somewhat uneasy relationship with Lacey. Management had actively campaigned against the city's incorporation during the early years, and this probably didn't set the best stage for cooperation between the new city and Panorama. Controversies arose about the naming of Slater-Kinney, the stop signs at the intersection of Slater-Kinney and 14th, water availability, and permitting. There was internal strife as well. A group of residents brought a lawsuit against Panorama, claiming that Panorama had violated their contracts by raising their rates. The lawsuit dragged on for years, with the residents winning and then settling on appeal. This lawsuit was one of the few instances, though, of resident versus management strife. By and large, residents have taken the side of management against the outside world, when necessary. By its 20th anniversary, Panorama seemed to be well on its way towards financial stability and growth. However, it was still not showing a profit for its investors. One of the major expenses, of course, was property taxes. Especially galling to investors was the fact that its chief competitors were retirement communities owned by churches, which were tax-free. So in 1987, the decision was finally made to recognize that Panorama was never going to turn a profit for its investors, and it filed for and received from the IRS nonprofit status as a 501c3 corporation. This was bitterly opposed, of course, by the Department of Revenue, Thurston County, and the city of Lacey. Up until that time, the Panorama Corporation was the largest property tax payer in Lacey and the third largest in Thurston County. The county's claim for taxes was appealed to the courts, and the county eventually lost. Ultimately, however, a state law was passed, and there are those in this room who facilitated the passage of that law, that assesses property taxes on all retirement communities in proportion to the number of low-income seniors that reside in the community. And by the way, this is why Panorama Management asks all residents every year to indicate whether they may be low income. Panorama's property taxes are lowered by thousands of dollars a year because of its commitment to support its residents regardless of income level. The resolution of tax issues and the fine selection of a board of directors and management who were and are devoted to the dual goals of supporting resident life while carefully managing assets paid dividends. Panorama residents now receive the highest ranking among CCRCs in the nation. I want to turn to the final theme of this talk, which is the fact that throughout its history, Panorama Management and residents have worked side by side to create the active and vibrant community it's always been. This is an element that I did not fully appreciate until I moved to Panorama. Rather than having a paid staff that arranges all resident activities, the vast majority of activities, outings, and groups, of which there are over 100, are organized and partly funded by residents. And if the resident is interested in starting up a group or going on an outing, management and staff work with the residents and with resident council to see that it happens. I read last month that if all the volunteer hours reported by residents were totaled, it amounts to the equivalent of 46 full-time workers. And if you add in unreported hours, I'm sure it's much, much more. J.T. Quigg, former president of Panorama, stressed this fact as Panorama went nonprofit in 1987.
Panorama is really just getting started again. The dream that Mo Loveless had here some 33 years ago has really been kind of brought to conclusion. Now it's time for a new dream, set a new vision, and to get underway. And I'm pleased to report that that's happening really right now as we speak, and that Panorama residents have a major leadership role in putting it together. When Mo Loveless did this all those 33 years ago, he didn't have a vibrant resident community of 1,200 people with the leaders we have today. He had to really do it on his own and wing it. We're blessed with marvelous leadership, really interested, talented, and concerned residents who are going to contribute successfully to see to it that the next 33 years at Panorama City are even brighter than those that have gone before.
Much of the credit for the cooperative spirit at Panorama goes to the Resident Council, which represents all independent living residents at Panorama and works closely with management. From the beginning, there were activities at Panorama that were initiated by and managed by residents. We had closed circuit TV from the mid-1960s, with the first show being a live broadcast of a Cassius Clay boxing match. We all remember who Cassius Clay ended up. Okay. Informal gatherings took place. This croquet match was in the first year of Panorama City's existence. The resident gardens were established early on, and here's Mo Loveless himself operating the front end loader to create the first pea patch, which was then where the Boulevard Park neighborhood is now. And social gatherings, of course, have always been and continue to be an almost daily experience at Panorama's restaurant. And I do encourage you, if you haven't been to the restaurant, it's a great place, reasonably priced, and we're going to have a new menu starting in the end of June, so come on down. Our quarterly literary magazine, The Voice, is 18 years old this year. It's noteworthy also that residents have provided a significant amount of funding for capital amenities. For many years, residents and management had been attempting to find a way to build an activity center with pool, fitness center, and state-of-the-art auditorium. Residents provided the seed money for this effort. Panorama then agreed to fund the building of the Aquatics and Fitness Center, which opened in 2005. The auditorium funding was still undetermined. A Build It Now campaign was launched, and residents provided almost all of the design concepts, oversight, and funding for the auditorium, which opened in 2009. Joe DeSanto, then Panorama's president, was visibly moved when he commented on this achievement. It's particularly noteworthy to me, at least, that since all of Panorama residents are elderly, they committed significant funds toward a facility that they knew they were building in significant part for a future generation of residents.
The high point of 2009, from my perspective, was the opening of the Panorama Auditorium. And it was wonderful, wasn't it? That building, which has a heart, was a labor of love and commitment by residents. It was designed by residents, it was built by residents, and it was paid for by residents.
In 1987, Doris Stussy returned to Panorama, as we've seen in the previous clip, and commented on the changes she saw on campus.
I don't know how many people realize how far you've really come at Panorama. Boy, you are beautiful. You are wonderful. And you are the answer to all my prayers as I'm going to cry.
Don't do that.
Yeah.
It is a wonderful
Well,
place.
I'm either going to cry or blow my nose, one or the other. but the truth of the matter is, as I walk around upstairs and in the corridors and I see two banks and the enlarged beauty salon, and everything is so special.
And the big pharmacy with groceries in it too.
Yeah. You know, gosh, when we began here, why, we were like peanuts trying to keep it all together.
So again, thank you so much, Don and the foundation and all of you for coming out on this beautiful day and inviting me to share some images and videos from Panorama's history. There have been plenty of bumps along the way, but the collective wisdom, energy, and spirit of collaboration that's characterized the relationship among residents and between residents and management continues to make this among the highest ranking continuing care retirement communities in the nation. And now I'd be glad to take a few questions or comments or corrections. Yes?
How many residents do you have at Panorama?
You have about 1,400 independent living, and then there's also the nursing facility, which comes and goes. I'll repeat the question also. The question was how many residents are at Panorama? Steve?
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about, I think his first name was Al, I forget what his last name was, but he was the dean of the UW Law School in the 1930s. He was one of the early residents out there, and he led the lawsuit and provided the free legal services against Panorama.
I don't remember his name. There was a group of about 4 or 5 residents who came together, and they formed I think it was actually a nonprofit corporation called the Committee for Fairness at Panorama or something like that. And I don't remember his name, Steve, I'm sorry, but I can get that to you. But yes, it was a protracted fight and went back and forth, and there's living judges here who were involved in, not here in this room, but who were involved in that battle. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Is Mo Loveless still around, or?
Is Mo Loveless still around? No, he died several years ago. I'm not sure what. A pretty long time ago. He actually did live on his yacht for some period of time, and then in his very last months he moved into the Chalet, and so was able to be interviewed there in the last few months of his life. Yes.
How do you handle the public restaurant with a nonprofit corporation?
Okay, the question is, how does it work having a regular restaurant with a nonprofit corporation? We actually have several places where you can buy things on Panorama. There's a gift shop, and then there's a pharmacy and so forth. The restaurant is owned by Panorama, and there are plenty of nonprofits who have businesses that charge funds. They're just not allowed to make a profit on them. And the restaurant certainly doesn't make a profit on its operations. Yeah.
Are you continuing to research and find out more and more from the past? Or do you feel you have done the past research and now to everything?
The question is, am I all done with my research about the past and moving on to new things? No, I am continuing to go back and look at the archives. I'm in the process now of going through old videos that have been made and contributed to the archives, and old slides and so forth. So I'm continually adding to the archives from previous times, but also my duty as an archivist is to keep up with what's unfolding now, and that's one thing I'm so grateful for past historians and archives for, is they recognize the importance of what they had and the importance of preserving it. So both ways works.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I missed it. When did Panorama City open?
The first residents moved in the fall of 1963. Yep. Steve?
I'm a little interested in the original Chambers donation land claim. Was it quite a bit bigger than Panorama is right now? I would assume so.
Yes, the question was whether the original David Chambers donation claim was bigger than the current campus of Panorama. Yes. It was 640 acres. It was under the Donation Claim Act. And I think only 20-some were originally sold off to the golf club. And then Mo Loveless also had bought a fair amount of property all the way down to Chambers Lake. And eventually that turned into the Panorama campus as well. So, but it still is quite a bit smaller than the original Chambers land claim, which is a good part of that end of the city of Lacey.
Why did you drop city from Panorama City?
Oh, I had that question when I gave this talk at Panorama a couple weeks ago. And I've heard a couple of different accounts of that, but I think the one that makes the most sense is that there is a community in California called Panorama City, California. And in order to, and Panorama City, California was the one who asked Panorama, our Panorama, to drop the city part. Another explanation that I had heard is that now that Lacey is a city, we don't need to be our own city as well. So you can take either one of those answers. Yes?
When you moved here 25 years ago, had you heard of Panorama then, or was it something you learned about once you moved here?
Okay, the question was, when I moved here in 1989, had I heard of Panorama? The answer is no, I hadn't heard of Panorama, but my parents and both sets of grandparents lived in continuing care retirement communities. So personally, I'm a big fan of that model of retirement, and we're just lucky to have been in a community that had its own, so it was an easy move. Sandra.
Okay. One of the distinguishing characteristics of Panorama is the beautiful landscaping and the old trees. And I have a feeling it was part of the original plan to leave some of the trees. Do you know any more about how the decisions were made?
Yeah, the question was, Panorama has a beautiful campus with a huge variety of trees. I think we have over 1,500 species, individual species of trees and shrubs. And the question was whether it was planned from the very beginning to accommodate trees that were already there and begin working on developing the landscape. And my understanding is yes, I've heard that one of the things that Loveless did when he laid out the core of the Panorama campus was that he took one of those limers that makes the white marks for football fields, and drove around and targeted trees that he wanted to avoid. And so he did preserve several of the trees, and that's why I think one of that huge cherry tree that's still on our campus may be one of the children of the original Chambers cherry tree. But if you look at aerials from the early 60s, it's not nearly as wooded as it is now. So a lot of those trees were just saplings when he first started developing. And of course, if you're in a golf course, I mean, trees are a golfer's nightmare. So I don't know how many of them were actually on the core of the campus when he first started laying it out. I'll take you next. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the Panorama continuing to expand? I noticed that it bought up some of the local homes around there, and I wonder if that's continuing or is it static?
The question is whether Panorama is continuing to expand. Maybe a bit of a sensitive question, but Slater Kinney from 21st on down to the lake has gradually, Panorama has gradually bought up the homes in Slater Kinney. And at this point, I walked down there the other day, and I believe there's one house left that's not Panorama. And I don't want to talk about the future of that house, but it may be fair to say it ultimately will be. Also, Panorama last year acquired a trailer park that's adjacent to campus, and they don't know what they're going to do with that at some point in the future, but I believe that is in their expansion plan. So acquiring infill, and then here and there where it makes economic sense is my understanding is their plan to expand a little bit, not a huge amount. Steve.
I understand that the rings in the older trees, one was cut down about a year ago, and they're very wide, indicating that the trees, most of them aren't really that old, and it's the watering and fertilizer as compared to a tree out in a forest that has made them so large. Have you heard that?
The question is whether the reason why there's so many large trees on campus is not that they're all that old, but that the extensive watering and fertilizing on campus has promoted their rapid growth. And I'm sure that's partly the case. And also just being in the Northwest and having a number of species that do reach a pretty good size. You might remember we had to cut down our sequoia about 4 or 5 years ago. It was one of the largest and oldest trees on campus. Yes, one more maybe.
One more. How many people are employed?
How many people are employed? I don't know. I know there's 27 grounds people alone. They have 400 approximately, we're hearing. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Monroe, way in the back.
One more fact for you, and that's 60% of our new residents at Panorama come from Thurston County.
Panorama board member Ralph Monroe says that 60% of Panorama residents come from Thurston County. Now, yeah. How many acres? Oh boy, you're asking a lot of questions. I'm thinking about 400 acres, but that's just a guess. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody have a better idea of that? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming out.